based on the true story of countless survivors. I was just 20 years old when I thought I was going on the adventure of a lifetime. What started as a dream trip to London became a nightmare that lasted 6 months. This is my story of survival. My name is Anna, and I'm a survivor of human trafficking. For years, I couldn't speak about what happened to me in London. But today, I share my story not for sympathy, but to help others recognize the signs and never give up hope. Because sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. Please subscribe to help this story reach more people and raise awareness about human trafficking. Chapter 1. The Girl from Uppsala. My story begins in Uppsala, a beautiful university city in Sweden, about an hour north of Stockholm. I grew up in a middle-class family. My father worked as an engineer, my mother as a nurse. Our house was typical Swedish. Clean lines, lots of wood, and windows that let in every precious ray of Nordic light during our long winters. At 20, I was studying literature at Uppsala University, dreaming of becoming a journalist. I loved languages. I spoke Swedish, English, and some German. My friends always said I was too trusting, too eager to see the good in everyone. Anna, my best friend Maya would say, "You think everyone has pure intentions like you do." If only I had listened to her warning. Uppsala felt safe, almost sleepy sometimes. Crime was rare, and as young women we walked alone at night without fear. The biggest excitement was the weekend parties at the student nations or the occasional trip to Stockholm. I had never traveled far from home. The farthest I'd been was Copenhagen for a weekend with my family. That spring of 2019, I saved every krona from my part-time job at a local cafe. I wanted to improve my English and see the world beyond Sweden's borders. London seemed perfect, close enough to feel safe, English-speaking, full of history and culture. My parents were supportive but worried. "Just be careful, Älskling," my mother said, using the Swedish endearment that meant darling. I booked a cheap hostel in Zone 2 and planned to stay for 2 weeks. I wanted to visit museums, see theater shows, maybe take some English classes. I packed light, just a backpack with clothes, my camera, and a guidebook with dog-eared pages from all my planning. As I boarded the plane at Stockholm Arlanda Airport, waving goodbye to my parents through the terminal window, I had no idea that this innocent journey would change my life forever. And not in the way I had dreamed. Landing at Heathrow felt like stepping into a movie. The accents, the rush of people, the red double-decker buses. Everything was exactly as I had imagined, yet more overwhelming than expected. I took the tube to my hostel in Shepherd's Bush, clutching my backpack and trying to look like I belonged. The hostel was basic but clean, filled with other young travelers from around the world. My roommates were 2 Australian girls doing a gap year and a German boy studying abroad. For the first few days I felt like I was living my dream. I visited the British Museum, walked along the Thames, took selfies with Big Ben in the background to send to my parents. On my 4th day I decided to explore Camden Market. The energy was infectious. Street performers, vintage stalls, food from every corner of the world. I was photographing some street art when a young man approached me. He was handsome, well-dressed, spoke with what I thought was a posh British accent. "You're not from around here," he said with a charming smile. "Let me guess, Scandinavian? Swedish?" I was impressed and flattered that he could tell. "I'm David," he said, extending a manicured hand. "And you're far too pretty to be wandering around London alone." David was smooth, confident, everything I wasn't. He offered to show me the real London, places tourists never found. He bought me coffee, listened intently as I talked about my studies, my dreams of becoming a journalist. He seemed fascinated by my life in Sweden, asking detailed questions about my family, my address, whether I was traveling alone. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags. But at 20, alone in a foreign city, I was flattered by the attention of this sophisticated older man. When he invited me to dinner that evening, I said yes without hesitation. That dinner invitation would be the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't have imagined in my worst dreams. David wasn't who he claimed to be, and I was about to learn that predators come disguised as Prince Charming. David picked me up from my hostel in an expensive car. He was impeccably dressed and smelled of expensive cologne. He took me to an upscale restaurant in Mayfair, the kind of place I'd only seen in movies. I felt underdressed in my simple Swedish clothes, but David kept complimenting me, making me feel special. During dinner, he painted a picture of glamorous London life. He claimed to work in international business and travel frequently. He asked more questions about my family, my plans in London when I was supposed to return to Sweden. I told him everything, how my parents didn't expect to hear from me daily, how I'd planned to travel independently for 2 weeks. After dinner, David suggested we go to a private club where his friends were waiting. The wine at dinner had made me feel relaxed and trusting. The club was in a basement in Soho, dimly lit with expensive-looking furniture. Several other well-dressed men were there, along with some young women who seemed Eastern European. "Anna, meet my business partners," David said, introducing me to men who studied me in a way that made me uncomfortable. One of them, a heavy-set man with cold eyes, spoke with an accent I couldn't place. "Very nice," he said, looking at me like I was merchandise. "Swedish, you said?" I began to feel uneasy. The atmosphere had changed. The women in the club seemed subdued, almost frightened. When I told David I wanted to go back to my hostel, he said it was too late. The tube had stopped running. "Don't worry, darling. You can stay at my place tonight. I have a spare room." His flat was luxurious but felt cold, almost sterile. David offered me another drink, insisting it would help me sleep. Despite my growing discomfort, I accepted. It was the last decision I would make freely for many months. Within minutes of drinking that glass, my vision began to blur. As consciousness slipped away, I heard David's voice, no longer charming but coldly businesslike. "She's perfect. The clients will pay well for this one." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I woke up in a small windowless room that smelled of dampness and fear. My head pounded and my mouth felt like cotton. I was lying on a dirty mattress on the floor, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, but my phone, money, and passport were gone. The door was locked from the outside. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I hammered on the door, screaming for help in Swedish, English, anything. No one came. The room was barely larger than a closet, with stained walls and a bucket in the corner that I realized was meant to be my toilet. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Finally, the door opened. It wasn't David. It was the heavy-set man from the club, along with another man I hadn't seen before. "Shut up," the first one said in accented English when I started to plead. "No one can hear you anyway." "Where am I? Where's David? I want to go home," I cried. The man laughed, a sound without warmth. "David did his job. Now you work for us. You do what we say when we say it, or things get very bad for you." The other man remained silent but carried something that looked like a weapon. They explained the rules in broken English mixed with what I later learned was Romanian. I belonged to them now. My passport was gone. No one knew where I was. If I tried to escape or refused to obey, they would hurt me and find my family in Sweden. They knew my parents' names, their address, where they worked. The first man, who told me to call him Victor, showed me photos on his phone, pictures of my parents' house, my mother leaving for work, my father at the grocery store. "We have people everywhere," he said with a cold smile. "You be good girl or mommy and daddy have accident." That night, as I lay on that filthy mattress listening to other voices crying in rooms nearby, I realized I wasn't alone in this nightmare. And I understood that my real fight for survival was just beginning. The next few days blurred together in a haze of fear and disbelief. Victor and his associates, I learned there were at least 5 men involved in this operation, had perfected their system of control. They used a combination of physical intimidation, psychological manipulation, and constant threats against my family to keep me compliant. I was moved to a different location, a rundown house in what I later discovered was East London. The windows were boarded up from the inside and the doors had multiple locks. There were other girls there, maybe 6 or 7 from different countries. Most looked younger than me. They spoke little English and communication was difficult, but fear was a universal language we all understood. The girls who had been there longer tried to help me understand the rules. "Don't fight at first," whispered a girl who might have been Romanian. "They hurt you bad if you fight too much at first. Wait, watch, learn." Her advice came from experience. I could see scars on her arms and a haunted look in her eyes that spoke of unimaginable suffering. Victor introduced me to Mama, an older woman who managed the day-to-day operations. She had once been in our position years ago, but had aged out of the profitable end of the business. Now she helped run it, a victim who had become complicit in her own survival. "You make money, you eat," she told me matter-of-factly. "You don't make money, you don't eat." The psychological warfare was perhaps worse than the physical conditions. They would show me fake news articles about Swedish girls who had disappeared in London, claiming that police didn't look for foreign prostitutes. They told me my parents thought I had abandoned them, that I was now a criminal who could never go home. They monitored everything: when we slept, what we ate, even when we used the bathroom. Privacy didn't exist. They rotated our locations every few weeks to avoid detection and to keep us disoriented. I never knew what part of London I was in or how to get help, even if I could escape the building. But Victor made one mistake that first week. He underestimated how carefully I was watching, learning, and planning. Because deep inside, where they couldn't reach, I held on to one unshakable truth. I was Anna from Uppsala, and I was not going to die in this place. The worst part of my ordeal began in the second week. Victor's operation wasn't just about control, it was about money. And that meant clients. The very word makes my stomach turn even now, years later. But I must tell this part of the story because it's the reality for thousands of women and girls around the world. The clients came from all walks of life: businessmen in expensive suits, working-class men who saved up for these visits, even some who claimed to be married with children. What united them was their willingness to pay for something they knew was wrong. They had to know we weren't there by choice. Our fear was obvious, our compliance clearly coerced. Some clients were violent. Others tried to convince themselves they were being kind by making small talk or bringing gifts. A few even seemed to feel guilty, but not enough to help or report what they were seeing. The psychological damage of these encounters was often worse than the physical harm. The feeling of being reduced to an object, of having your humanity stripped away piece by piece. Victor's network was sophisticated. They advertised online, used code words, and had different locations for different types of clients. They moved us around London constantly, sometimes to houses, sometimes to hotels, once even to what looked like an office building after hours. The geography meant nothing to me. Everywhere was prison. I learned to dissociate, to separate my mind from what was happening to my body. I would recite Swedish poems my grandmother had taught me, or plan the articles I would write someday when I got home. I held conversations with my parents in my head, promising them I would survive, that I would come home. The other girls taught me small acts of resistance and survival. How to hide small amounts of money. How to recognize which clients were most dangerous. How to preserve some tiny piece of dignity in the midst of complete degradation. We developed a silent language of support, small gestures that said, "You are not alone, you are not forgotten." But it was during one of these encounters that I overheard something that would change everything. A conversation between Victor and a client about moving the operation to a new location. And I realized this might be my only chance to escape. The conversation I overheard was in a mixture of English and what I now know was Romanian. Victor was angry about increased police activity in the area and was planning to move the entire operation to Birmingham within 2 weeks. "Clean slate," he kept saying. "New girls, new clients, no problems." I understood what this meant. In Birmingham, I would know even less about my surroundings. The chances of escape would be virtually zero. If I was going to act, it had to be here in London, and it had to be soon. Over the next few days, I watched everything more carefully than ever. I memorized the schedules, when the guards changed shifts, when Mama went to buy food, when Victor visited other locations. I noticed that on Wednesdays, there was about a 20-minute window in the late afternoon when only one guard was in the building. The other girls sensed something was different about me. The Romanian girl, who I learned was called Ioana, pulled me aside one evening. "You thinking stupid thoughts," she whispered urgently. "They catch you, they make example. They hurt all of us." But in her eyes I saw something else, a flicker of hope that she was trying to suppress. I began to test small boundaries. I volunteered to help Mama with food preparation, learning the layout of the kitchen. I paid attention to which doors were locked and which weren't. I noticed that the back door had 3 locks, but during the day only 2 were usually engaged. The psychological pressure was enormous. Part of me wanted to give up, to accept this as my life and stop fighting. The constant fear, the degradation, the threats against my family. It was designed to break your spirit. But every time I felt myself sinking, I would remember my mother's face, my father's laugh, the snow falling in Uppsala at Christmas. Then came Tuesday night, 3 days before the planned move to Birmingham. Victor made an announcement that changed everything. "Tomorrow, big client coming." Everyone must be perfect. But his VIP client would unknowingly provide me with the distraction I needed for my desperate escape attempt. The VIP client arrived Wednesday afternoon in a chauffeur-driven car. From the window, I could see Victor and his men practically bowing as they greeted someone who was clearly very important to their business. The entire house was in chaos as they prepared, bringing in expensive alcohol, flowers, and directing all their attention to this one visit. This was my chance, but it came with enormous risk. If I failed, the punishment would be severe, not just for me but for the other girls as well. Victor had made that clear many times. But I couldn't get on that van to Birmingham. I knew in my heart that if I left London, I would never leave alive. The afternoon unfolded exactly as I had observed over previous weeks. Mama left to buy special food for the VIP. 2 guards accompanied the client and one of the other girls to the upper floor. That left only Dimitri, the youngest and least experienced guard, watching the rest of us in the main room. At exactly 4:47 p.m., I had memorized the time Dimitri's phone rang. It was Victor, needing him upstairs to help with something related to the VIP visit. "Watch them," he told us girls, as if we could guard ourselves. "I'll be back in 5 minutes." My heart pounded so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This was it. The back door was in the kitchen 20 steps away. I had noticed that during the day rush for the VIP, someone had forgotten to engage the 3rd lock, the one that required a key. I stood up casually as if going to use the bathroom. Joanna caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Later, I learned that she and the other girls created small distractions, dropping things, asking for water, anything to give me a few extra seconds. The kitchen was empty. The back door looked massive, like the entrance to freedom or death. I could hear Victor's voice upstairs, the VIP client laughing, Dimitri's footsteps moving around. I turned the first lock. It clicked quietly. The second lock, another soft click. The third was already unlocked. I put my hand on the door handle, said a prayer in Swedish, and opened it to face the gray London afternoon that would either be my salvation or my grave. The door opened onto a narrow alley behind the house. After months of being locked inside, the fresh air hit me like a physical shock. For a moment, I froze. After so long in captivity, the outside world felt almost too big, too overwhelming. But I could hear sounds from inside the house that meant my escape had probably been discovered. I ran. I had no shoes except thin slippers, no coat despite the October cold, no money, no identification. I just ran down that alley like my life depended on it, because it did. London was a maze to me. I had no idea where I was or which direction to go. I just kept running, turning corners randomly, staying away from main streets where Victor's men might spot me. My feet were bleeding from the rough pavement, my lungs burning from months of poor air and little exercise. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, I collapsed behind a dumpster in another alley. I was shaking uncontrollably from cold, fear, adrenaline, and the psychological shock of suddenly being free. For the first time in months, no one was watching me, controlling my movements, telling me what to do. But freedom was terrifying too. I spoke limited English, had no money, no identification, and no idea where I was. I was also deeply traumatized and struggling to think clearly. Victor's threats about police not helping foreign prostitutes echoed in my mind. What if they didn't believe me? What if they sent me back? As darkness fell, I knew I couldn't stay hidden behind that dumpster forever. I was getting hypothermic, and I could hear cars driving slowly through nearby streets, Victor's men searching for me. I had to find help, but who could I trust? Who would believe my story? Then I remembered something from my first day in London, a lifetime ago. A sign I had seen while walking to Camden Market. A sign that said, "Help available 24/7" with a phone number. Shivering and desperate, I stepped out of that alley and approached the first person I saw, an elderly woman walking her dog. "Please," I whispered in broken English, "help me call police. I was kidnapped." And for the first time in months, someone looked at me with kindness instead of ownership. The elderly woman's name was Margaret. She was 73 years old, a retired teacher who was walking her small terrier, Buster, when a half-frozen, terrified Swedish girl stumbled out of an alley and begged for help. Later, Margaret would tell me that she knew immediately something terrible had happened. My eyes, she said, looked like those of a frightened animal. Margaret didn't hesitate. She wrapped her own coat around my shoulders, called the police from her mobile phone, and stayed with me until they arrived. She held my hand and kept repeating, "You're safe now, love. You're safe now." Those were the first kind words I had heard in months. The police response was professional but overwhelming. I was taken to a station where I was interviewed by officers trained in human trafficking cases. Detective Inspector Sarachan was patient with my limited English and obvious trauma. She assured me repeatedly that I was not in trouble, that I was a victim, not a criminal. The hardest part was telling my story. Speaking about what had happened made it real again. I broke down multiple times, unable to find words in English for some experiences, switching between Swedish and English in my distress. But Detective Chin kept encouraging me, taking notes, recording everything carefully. They took me to a hospital for medical examination and treatment. The physical evidence of my ordeal was documented. I was malnourished, had untreated infections, and showed signs of prolonged psychological stress. But I was alive and I was free, and slowly I began to believe that the nightmare was really over. The most emotional moment came when they allowed me to call my parents. I hadn't spoken to them in over 6 months. When my mother answered the phone and heard my voice, she started crying so hard she couldn't speak. My father took the phone and just kept saying, "Anna? Anna? Is it really you?" in Swedish. But even as I lay in that hospital bed, speaking to my parents for the first time in months, I knew my ordeal wasn't truly over. Victor was still out there, and there were other girls still trapped in that system. And something was growing inside me, a determination that this nightmare would not be for nothing. Detective Inspector Chen visited me every day during my week-long stay in the hospital. As my English improved and my psychological state stabilized, I was able to provide more detailed information about Victor's operation, locations I remembered, faces I could describe, the system they used to control us. The police investigation moved quickly. My escape had panicked Victor's network, and they were making mistakes, moving locations frequently, changing their patterns. But I had given the police enough information to begin tracking them down. "Anna," Detective Chen told me on my 4th day in the hospital, "we've identified the house where you were held. We've also found 2 other locations connected to the same network. But we need to move fast. They're clearly planning to relocate everything soon." The raid happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my escape. Police hit 3 locations simultaneously across East London. They rescued 12 girls and women, including Joanna, who had helped create distractions during my escape. 6 men were arrested, including Victor and Dmitry. When Detective Chen told me about the rescue, I cried for hours. Not just tears of relief, but tears of guilt too. Why had I escaped when others couldn't? Why was I free while they had suffered for additional days? The survivor's guilt was overwhelming and would take years of therapy to work through. Joanna was brought to the same hospital where I was recovering. Seeing her again was emotional. We held each other and cried without speaking for a long time. She was the only other person who truly understood what we had survived. "You did it," she whispered to me in broken English. "You got us out." The media attention was intense but handled carefully by the police. My name was kept confidential, but the story of the Swedish student who escaped and helped rescue other trafficking victims made headlines. I was overwhelmed by messages of support from strangers around the world. My parents arrived from Sweden that afternoon. When I saw them walk through the hospital door, my father's worried face, my mother's tear-stained cheeks, I realized that some kinds of freedom can't be given by police or courts. They can only be given by love. 3 weeks after my escape, I was medically cleared to return to Sweden. The flight from London to Stockholm felt surreal. The last time I had been on a plane, I was an innocent 20-year-old excited about adventure. Now I was returning as a survivor of human trafficking, forever changed by experiences I couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived them. My parents met me at Stockholm Arlanda Airport with a small group of family members. Everyone was crying tears of joy, relief, and grief for what I had endured. My mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, as if she was afraid I might disappear again. My father, usually so strong, wept openly as he held me. Returning to Uppsala felt like visiting a previous life. My childhood room looked exactly as I had left it, but I was not the same person who had packed that backpack months earlier. The simple things that used to bring me joy, Swedish pastries, snow falling outside my window, my favorite books, felt hollow at first, as if trauma had stolen my ability to experience normal happiness. The nightmares were the worst part. I would wake up screaming, thinking I was back in that windowless room. crowds made me panic. The sound of multiple locks clicking would send me into flashbacks. My parents found me a trauma counselor who specialized in trafficking survivors. Dr. Anderson became my lifeline back to psychological health. I couldn't return to university immediately. The concentration required for academic work was beyond me in those first months. Instead, I focused on healing, on therapy, on slowly rebuilding trust in the world and in other people. Some days were better than others. Some days I felt strong and determined. Other days I could barely get out of bed. But something else was growing alongside the trauma. A sense of purpose. I had survived for a reason. I had information that could help other victims. I had a story that could educate people about the realities of human trafficking. The journalist in me, buried but not destroyed by my ordeal, began to resurface. 6 months after my return, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I was going back to London, not as a victim this time, but as an advocate. Because there were still girls like Joanna who needed someone to speak for them. My decision to return to London horrified my parents initially. "Anna, why would you go back to that place?" my mother asked, tears in her eyes. But I knew I had to. The trial of Victor and his associates was approaching, and the prosecutor needed my testimony. More importantly, I had learned that new trafficking networks were already filling the gap left by Victor's arrest. I contacted Detective Inspector Chin and told her about my decision. She put me in touch with organizations working with trafficking survivors, groups that needed people who understood the system from the inside. My lived experience, combined with my journalism background and language skills, made me uniquely qualified to help. I started by working with a charity called Freedom's Path, founded by other survivors and dedicated to victim support and prevention education. My first role was simple: sitting with newly rescued women in hospitals, being a familiar face who could say, "I survived this too. You can survive this too." The work was emotionally devastating at first. Each new survivor brought back memories of my own captivity. But it was also healing. Transforming my trauma into something that could help others gave my suffering meaning. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was becoming a voice for justice. I began speaking at conferences and training sessions for police, social workers, and medical professionals. I helped them understand how traffickers recruit victims, how they maintain control, and most importantly, how to approach survivors with sensitivity and understanding. My story attracted media attention, which I initially resisted. But I learned that publicity could be a powerful tool for awareness and prevention. I gave my first television interview on the first anniversary of my escape. It was terrifying but necessary. "Why do you do this work?" the interviewer asked. "Why put yourself through reliving these experiences?" My answer came from the deepest part of my heart. Because somewhere right now there's a girl like I was, and she needs to know that survival is possible, that there are people fighting for her, that she matters. But my real test as an advocate came when Detective Chin called with news that would force me to confront my past more directly than ever before. "Anna, we found a new network. And we need your help to infiltrate their recruitment methods." Detective Chen's proposal was both terrifying and compelling. Intelligence indicated that a new trafficking network was using social media and dating apps to recruit young women, particularly targeting Scandinavian tourists in London. They wanted me to help identify their recruitment tactics by posing as a potential victim. "We would never ask you to put yourself in physical danger," Detective Chen assured me. "This would be online surveillance and maybe one supervised meeting in a public place. But your insights into how they operate could help us shut them down before they harm more women." The idea of deliberately engaging with potential traffickers triggered every trauma response I had. My therapist, Dr. Anderson, was initially opposed. Anna, you've made tremendous progress in your healing. Why risk that for this operation? But after several sessions, she understood why I needed to do it. Working with police cybercrime specialists, I created fake social media profiles using my real knowledge of Swedish culture and the mindset of a young tourist. Within days, I was contacted by men using eerily similar tactics to those David had used on me: flattery, offers to show me exclusive parts of London, questions about my family and travel plans. The similarities were chilling. These predators had clearly studied successful recruitment methods. They knew exactly how to identify vulnerable targets and build trust quickly. But now I could see their tactics clearly, analyze their approach, document their methods for law enforcement. One contact seemed particularly sophisticated. Marcus claimed to be a British businessman who loved Scandinavian culture. His profile showed expensive restaurants, luxury travel, a lifestyle designed to impress young women. But I noticed details that suggested careful construction rather than authentic luxury. The psychological strain of the undercover work was enormous. Even though I knew it was surveillance, engaging with these predators brought back vivid memories of my initial encounter with David. Some nights I would finish a chat session and spend hours in therapy calls with Dr. Anderson, processing the emotional impact. After 2 weeks of online surveillance, Detective Chin made an unexpected request. Anna, we need you to agree to meet Marcus in person. We'll have you completely covered with surveillance, but we need to catch him in the act of recruitment. Are you prepared to face one of them again? The meeting was set for a coffee shop in Covent Garden, the same area where I had been so enchanted by London's energy during my first innocent visit. Police surveillance teams were positioned throughout the area, and I wore recording equipment designed to look like ordinary jewelry. Marcus arrived exactly on time, and I felt my stomach lurch with recognition, not of his face but of his type. He was handsome, well-dressed, charming in exactly the way David had been. But this time I saw through the performance. I knew what lay beneath the smile. Anna, you're even more beautiful than your photos, he said, kissing my hand in a gesture designed to seem romantic. I'm so glad you reached out. London can be overwhelming for a young woman traveling alone. Every word was calculated, designed to establish both attraction and dependency. As he talked, using lines I now recognized as standard recruitment techniques, I thought about all the young women who had sat in similar coffee shops, having similar conversations, never suspecting they were talking to a predator. My role was to let him reveal his methods while staying safe myself. I have some friends having a small gathering tonight, Marcus said after an hour of building rapport. Very exclusive, very upscale. You'd love them. The invitation came exactly as expected, exactly as my training had prepared me for. This was the moment when the trap would normally close. That sounds wonderful, I replied, playing my role as the interested tourist. Where is it? As he began describing a location in East London, Detective Chen's voice came through my hidden earpiece. We have enough. Signal when you're ready. I excused myself to use the restroom, where I gave the agreed signal to the surveillance team. Within minutes, Marcus was surrounded by plainclothes officers. The look of shock and then rage on his face as he was arrested brought back memories of Victor, but this time I felt powerful, not powerless. Later, Detective Chin told me that Marcus's phone contained contacts for dozens of young women, many from Scandinavia. Your work potentially saved countless victims, Anna, she said. But I knew the real victory wasn't in catching one predator. It was in proving to myself that I had transformed from victim to survivor to protector. 5 years later, as I write this story, I run a foundation that has helped rescue over 300 trafficking victims and trained thousands of law enforcement officers. The girl from Uppsala who just wanted to see London became a woman who helps ensure other girls can travel safely, can trust again, can reclaim their lives. My name is Anna, I am a survivor, and this is how I turned my darkest nightmare into a beacon of hope for others. Because sometimes the most powerful way to heal from trauma is to ensure that others don't suffer the same fate. And sometimes the greatest victory is not just surviving, it's making sure that survival means something. If you or someone you know needs help, the National Human Trafficking Hotline is available 24/7. You are not alone. Help exists. Recovery is possible. And your life has value beyond measure.